ladies and gentlemen. Anthony Bergen's my name. I'm a senior analyst here at ASPI, and very appreciative of people coming out tonight to hear our guests from Europe. Well, I was just saying to the ambassador, what a year it's been for Europe. What an incredible year. We've seen the the UK, of course, leave the EU. We've seen this spate of terrorist attacks in Paris, Nice, Normandy and elsewhere. We've seen renewed aggression from the Russians. We've seen a bloody failed coup in Turkey. We've all been witnessing on our TVs night after night this massive refugee crisis, asylum seekers pouring in from the Middle East and North Africa. I think we've seen many European countries following what I'd call a fairly blustery form of nationalism and isolationism, and much of that seems to be directed at the EU and, of course, foreigners. I think it'd be fair to say, Ambassador, that for many of us looking at what's happened in Europe over the last 12 months, that we have a certain degree of worry about whether Europe will play an influential global role. I don't want to sound pessimistic, because I'm sure our speaker tonight is going to offer a very positive view of Europe's global role and its strategy in a much more contested world. So I will now hand it over to Ambassador Sem Fabrizi, the Ambassador of the EU to Australia, to introduce our special guest tonight. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Anthony, and I can be assured that Europe is alive and kicking, but also that the year hasn't finished yet. So we are only at the end of September, so we have still 4 months to go, and certainly many other events, not only in Europe, can happen. They can give us the guide for what the future will looks like. So I'd like to thank you, ASPI, for partnering with us to host this event. ASPI is playing a tremendous role to help the European Union to be also part of the conversation in the Australia foreign and security establishment throughout the country, and I'm also happy that ASPI and its director, Peter Jennings, also part of the European Union Australia Leadership Forum we have successfully launched only last week. So thank you very, very much. So I'm happy that we can discuss a little bit of foreign policy. It is an interesting and tremendously interesting moment to talk about foreign policy. The whole diplomatic community just returned from 2 weeks in New York at the UNGA, where also a number of ministers and half of the cabinet of Syrian cabinet was there, the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Immigration, Defense and others, and a lot of discussion has been going on. And also half of the Commission was also there, Federica Mogherini, President Tusk, and all the Commission. It's been the big gathering, a lot of stuff is on our plate. We have refugee, we have migration, we have sustainable development, Syria, nuclear proliferation, and so on and so forth. So it's not something that is peculiar only to us, to Europe. We have our own challenge, but the many challenges are common. It doesn't know borders, and in that sense, Europe and Australia are much closer than we might think. And the week before UNGA in New York, the Foreign Minister Bishop was in Brussels for an important meeting with Federica Mogherini. So the EU-Australia relations are going very, very well, and they are part of this conversation. We are happy to discuss also foreign policy, not only because we come from Brussels and New York, but also because the European Union has traditionally been associated with an economic dimension, which is very important, and also to an capacity to interact, especially through so-called soft power, is something that we like. We are very proud of our soft power, but it's not the whole story. There's also something else which is gradually emerging and taking root. So this is exactly the debate we hope to have tonight on Europe as a security provider. Maybe if I ask some of you if you think the European Union is running military and civilian operation, probably people say, I didn't know it. But they happen. We have almost 6,000 people in uniform and not in uniform in 17 missions throughout the world, from Balkans, in Asia, in the European neighborhood. But most importantly for tonight, we have a strategy. Usually you say, hey, I have a vision. We have a strategy, and the strategy has been drafted in the past 2 years and has been published only in June, last June, 2 days after the British referendum. And this strategy is the first one after 13 years. The previous one was in 2003. This one in 2016, in a completely different geostrategic scenario. And this strategy opened with a challenging sentence, and I quote, "The purpose or even existence of our European Union is being questioned." And the strategy concludes by saying, I quote again, "Our European citizen, deserve a true union which promotes our shared interests by engaging responsible and in partnership with others." The explanation of what is between this initial phrase and this closing phrase is 50 pages, and I leave Nathalie Tocci, who has been the drafter of this important strategy, to explain what is in the strategy and what is the strategy's meaning for European Union and its partners, including Australia, and how we are already working for its implementation. Nathalie is Deputy Director of Institute for International Affairs, a think tank, leading think tank in Italy and in Europe. She held previously research position in Brussels, in Washington, and in Italy. Her research area include European foreign policy, conflict resolution, the Middle East and the Mediterranean, multilateralism, and Turkey. So I hope to join me in a round of applause and to introduce Nathalie.
Thank you, Sem, and thank you for hosting me here this evening. So what I wanted to do with you this evening, rather than simply tell you the story of the global strategy, which you can read if you're interested, and I hope you are, or at least will be after you hear me speak this evening, is really try and explain where we were back in 2003 and where we are now and what has changed. I say 2003 because, as Sem was highlighting, this was the only time actually, that the European Union produced what was then called a European security strategy. 13 years have passed, 13 long years have passed, and the context has changed quite dramatically. And in 2016, for the first time, the European Union produced its first EU global strategy. And let me go through those changes by focusing on the change of context, the change in the process, the change in the content, and the change in the action that is to follow. And this is really where we are today. And let me begin with the context, because it's really that change of context which informs the changes in process, in content, and in action. So back in 2003, the European Union had never been so prosperous, so secure, and so free. That's how the opening line of the European security strategy, that's what it starts off with. And indeed, today that may sound like a sort of form of Euro hubris, but indeed at the time it was justified. It was justified because 3 years before, there was the accomplishment of probably the most important achievement of European integration, i.e. the single currency. 1 year after, in 2004, the EU achieved what is commonly known as the greatest foreign policy success of the European Union, i.e. its enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe. Again, in those years, we were at the time in which we were on the eve of what eventually became the European Neighbourhood policy. And this was basically an attempt by the European Union to respond to all those others that were knocking at the door, to which we couldn't simply say, well, come in, because obviously we had just almost doubled in size. We were just about to double in size with the Eastern enlargement, but we had to somehow respond to the desire of those countries to move closer to the European Union. So basically, it was a pretty good time. Now, that doesn't mean to say that obviously it was a time without its difficulties, and the difficulties that we had very much informed why the European security strategy was actually produced. As I'm sure you will recall, 2003 was also the year in which the Iraq War started. And the war in Iraq essentially created a huge split within the European Union between France and Germany on the one hand and the United Kingdom on the other. And the European security strategy was really an attempt to create a common narrative, to recreate a common narrative that would bridge over that divide. It was also a broader time in which the international liberal order was basically unchallenged. And that was the broader global context in which both obviously the United States and the European Union operated within. Now, clearly the context today is quite different. Before producing the EU Global Strategy, we spent the first 6 months of what High Representative Vice President of the Commission, Federica Mogherini, described as a process of strategic reflection. So the first 6 months were dedicated to produce a first document, commonly known as a strategic assessment. So that was the picture, if you like, the sort of description of the world before we actually stepped into the strategy part, which was basically and therefore what do we do about it. And that document painted the picture of a world which, unlike 2003, is more contested, more connected, and more complex. And it's those 3 C's that really describe that change of context, which then inform what the strategy is all about. Now, the world is more complex in different ways, obviously. It's more complex, and probably the most important meaning of that is that whereas back in the early 2000s, we lived in times of basically unipolarity, and it was precisely that unipolarity within which Europe began operating, in a sense, as a foreign policy actor, and which essentially embedded the broader international liberal order. Now we're in a process of clearly transition away from that, but we're not quite there in terms of an alternative system. We're not quite there in terms of a multipolar order. And I often quote Gramsci here. Gramsci in his prison notebooks said, it's a bit of an odd English translation, but let me try and do it. When an old order is dying, but a new order is yet to be born, that process of transition, that process of shades of grey, is a time in which monsters emerge. And clearly these are times of monsters. Now those times of monsters bring us to the second C, the fact that the world and Europe itself is more contested, more conflictual. And that contestation and that conflictuality emerges in different shapes and forms. Clearly, when we started working on this, the assessment, we were mainly concentrating on our east, on our south. The re-emergence of Russia and the attempt of Russia to essentially challenge the European security order, destabilization of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea to the east, and the implosion to the south. The fact that what is commonly known as, if you like, the Sykes-Picot order in the Middle East is being challenged, and it may indeed be in the process of collapsing. We don't quite know. I think I'm always a bit cautious about historical comparisons, but probably the Middle East and North Africa are in their equivalent of the 30 Years' War. We don't quite know where it's going to end, but what the ultimate result will likely be very different from the way the Middle East looks certainly today, or how it looked before 2011, before the Arab uprisings began. Since, if you like, that year, obviously those two massive problems are still there. But added on to that have been problems within the European Union itself. And of course, we know which ones these are. Terrorism as a huge problem. And here I think it's important to highlight the fact that we are talking about homegrown terrorism. These are European citizens committing these crimes. And in a sense, the paradox is that we actually export more than we import terrorism, if we think about the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters. I think it's important to bear that connection in mind because it's very easily then conflated with the migration situation. And those two phenomena actually are, it's important to actually keep them very separate. They're both issues. One is very clearly a threat, the other is very clearly a challenge, but we're talking about two separate phenomena here. So clearly there are problems within the European Union connected to terrorism. There are problems more broadly within the European Union that have to do with the rise of populism, the rise of Euroscepticism, the divisions between and within member states. So there's greater contestation within the European Union itself. Now, why do I say all this? I say all this because clearly the context in which you operate determines what will then eventually be in the strategy itself. Because I think the first question one needs to ask oneself when engaging in an exercise such as this, and I know that Australia is about to engage in a process such as this, is, why are you doing this? Why are you writing a strategy? And the reason why we had to do a strategy was actually very internal. Much like in 2003, the aim was that of recreating that shared narrative that could bring Europeans together over foreign and security policy, the shared vision, one half of the title, and the second is the common action. Give a broad sense of direction which will bring together both the member states and EU institutions in terms of moving forward in order to address those challenges, those threats, but also those opportunities that a more connected world presents. So that's where we were and where we are in terms of context. Now, a few words about process. Back in 2003, it was a fairly straightforward process. Basically, the way in which it was done was the document was written by pretty much one person, same in 2016. But back in 2003, that one person wrote it over, I think, a weekend. That's what he told me. And it was discussed a couple of times in the Council amongst member states, and then it was adopted by the European Council. I think they organized, in terms of outreach, 3 seminars in different European capitals. Now, obviously, because of that change of context, in 2016, the process had to be fundamentally different. And it had to be fundamentally different both on the side of the public outreach and consultation, but also in terms of the internal and institutional process and procedures. So clearly, because the whole point of the exercise was that of recreating a shared narrative and using also foreign policy as a means of reinstilling, if you like, some hope and confidence in the European project, we couldn't simply have a couple of seminars. We really had to engage a much, much broader public. And if you take a look at the very last page of that document, you'll find an annex, and you'll find all the organizations, the institutions that contributed to this process. Over the course of almost 1 year, we organized more than 50 events. Every single EU capital organized at least one. Many capitals, as the number suggests, organized more than one. They all saw the participation of, be it the foreign minister, minister of defense, at times the head of state himself or herself. So there was a sort of very intense, if you like, public outreach dimension. Then we had all sorts of input coming in. I received input from across the board, from the Association of Catholic Churches through to defense industry associations, trade unions, you name it, NGOs, etc. And I really made a huge effort in trying to use as much as possible everything that I received. And this was actually quite a good piece of advice that the penholder of one of the penholders of the US 2015 National Security Strategy gave me. He said, Natalie, when you're working on this, and I went to the US fairly early on, in November of last year, and he said, use when you can specific bits of wording that you receive, because people are going to read themselves in it. And even if they actually don't like the rest of the document, they're going to love it if they find themselves somewhere in the document. And I thought that was a really good piece of advice, which I used, and it actually paid off. So this was, in a sense, the public side of it. Then we had, obviously, the institutional side of it, and that was, again, far more complex than what it was back in 2003. Firstly, because when it comes to the member states, we are no longer 15 member states, but 28. So that's almost double, obviously, in size. And because of these multiple cleavages within the European Union, it wasn't simply one cleavage that we had to bridge over. It wasn't just a division between France, Germany, and the UK over Iraq or the transatlantic relationship. It was differences over Russia, over the role of European defense, over migration issues. So there were multiple divisions and differences that had to be bridged over. It required a far more intense process of consultation with the member states themselves. Then there's the European Commission, and that's another major difference in the process and the content with respect to 2003. I started off by saying that in 2003, this was a European security strategy. Why was it a European security strategy? Because the person in charge of the exercise was then High Representative Javier Solana. And Javier Solana was only a High Representative. In this case, Federica Mogherini, after the Lisbon Treaty, is both High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission. And she was determined right from the outset to make sure that this was a process, and it was therefore, in the end, a strategy which reflected those two hats. And why did she think it was so important? She thought it was important because ultimately, and this is not true only for the European Union, it's true for any foreign policy actor, whatever the challenge, the opportunity, or the threat that you're facing, very rarely will you be able to achieve results by the single use of one policy or instrument. It is always the combined use of security, diplomacy, defense, development, energy, climate. It's the full range, if you like, of external action instruments and the specific combination that you use that can hope to deliver in world affairs in the 21st century. So we really had to bring in the European Commission in this exercise, because whereas when it comes to diplomacy and defense, we have the External Action Service and basically the member states, which represent, if you like, the hardcore. Diplomacy and defense is still an area where most of the competences lie with the member states themselves. But when it comes to these other areas of foreign policy, from trade to development, energy to migration, actually it's the European Commission that has lots of the goodies. And we had to make sure that we brought them into the process too, and that we made sure that they were talking to one another. So it was a far more complex process, both on the official institutional side and on the public outreach and consultation side. Thirdly, the differences in content. How is it that what we said back in 2003 differs from what we're saying today in 2016? And again, this obviously relates very closely to this dramatic change in context that we're facing. I would say that back in 2003, precisely because of this optimism that really imbued much of what the European Union was doing in the world, we were in, if you like, transformational mode. The whole point of the exercise was that of helping others become more like us. And we were doing that because we thought, rightly so, that they did want to become more like us, be it countries in the process of enlargement, which took place, as I said, the following year, be it countries in what eventually became the European Neighbourhood policy, both to the east and to the south, but all the way up to Russia. The nature of the relationship between the European Union and Russia back in the early 2000s was really an approach based on, let's call it, loose Europeanization. We were never expecting Russia to become a member of the European Union, but we thought that through its membership in the Council of Europe, in the OSCE, eventually Russia, and through the bilateral relationship with the European Union, Russia would come closer to the EU itself. Our approach to regional organizations was very similar. Basically, the European Union was, in many respects, still is, the gold standard of regional integration. And the assumption, it was never spelled out so bluntly, but the overall assumption that we had in those years was really that the aim was trying to help transform these regional organizations, again, to become closer and look more like the European Union itself. And then finally, two final points about the content of 2003, and it's obviously connected. One has to do with the US and the other has to do with the multilateral order. The US, back in the 2003 document, is present, it's very present. More than being present as an actor, which obviously it is present because it is the overarching lens through which we used to observe the world. And again, the very reason why the 2003 strategy was produced was precisely that of bridging over the divide created by the war in Iraq. In before I move to 2016, last point about the multilateral order. In 2003, largely because, again, of the war in Iraq, the main aim was that of preserving the existing multilateral system. Because of the, if you like, US attack on the UN in that period, we were in preservation mode. Back in 2003, the phrase effective multilateralism was coined precisely as a European response to defend, if you like, the UN-centered multilateral system. So how does this all change in the European Union global strategy in 2016? Now, we're clearly no longer in that transformational mode anymore. And the point that we're trying to make in the strategy is that although we may not be able to transform everyone and make everyone look like us, the answer isn't to simply retrench and bury our heads in the sand. Because the truth is that in this more connected world, and especially if you live in Europe, there is no way of keeping the world outside. The world comes to you, even if you don't particularly like, if you like, what's coming in. Now, does that mean that, therefore, we have to simply become tough and engage in realpolitik? Well, the answer is no to that, too. We have to somehow find a way between the transformational and the transactional, and that's why we highlight concepts like resilience. We have to aim to promote the resilience of states and societies in our surrounding regions, both to the east and to the south. To the east, stretching all the way into Central Asia, to the south, stretching all the way down into Central Africa. And resilience has different meanings. Resilience has clear security connotations to it. It has clear economic and development connotations to it. But resilience also has meaning if we're talking about societal resilience, climate, energy. So different policy areas the very term resilience will imply different policy responses. The second aspect, which really comes out quite strongly in the 2016 strategy as opposed to the 2003 strategy, is really the idea that Europeans have to grow up in security and defense terms. And this has to do with the fact that as opposed to 2003, in which, as I said, the United States was the overarching lens through which we observed the world, and the underlying assumption was that the US was there and would remain there to protect European security. In 2016, we obviously still rely very much on the United States, but the United States has been telling us for quite some time that we actually have to grow up because it is inevitably looking increasingly elsewhere, particularly obviously towards this part of the world, and the obviously great attention in the US to China. It's been distracted quite a lot in recent years because of the implosion in the Middle East, but there is a structural trend going on then that is inevitable and cannot but grow moving forward. Under a Trump America, obviously that, who knows where that would go. Under a Hillary US, obviously, There's going to be a degree of greater predictability. But nonetheless, as I said, there is something structural there, and Europeans need to hear that message. They need to hear the music coming from Washington, and the music coming from Washington is, yes, of course, you shouldn't be duplicating NATO and what have you, but you've got to get more serious on security and defense. And if you look at the strategy, and you look in particular, you read at the security and defense elements in the strategy, what emerges there is that yes, the European Union, and in particular the common security and defence policy, has to engage in external crisis response, as well as in the capacity building of our partners. But the CSDP also has to engage more in terms of the protection of Europe itself. What does the protection of Europe mean? No, it doesn't mean that the EU is going to start doing collective defence, but it does mean that it's going to start engaging much more on those areas, particularly those that lie at the nexus between the internal and the external, that actually matter tremendously for the security of European citizens. What are we talking about? We're talking about cyber, we're talking about hybrid, we're talking about counterterrorism, we're talking about border management. More broadly, we're talking about the protection of land, air, and sea borders. These are the areas which do not really require hard military gear. They also require an element of that, but we're basically talking about areas which lie in between the hard and the soft, between the internal and the external. And these are areas in which the European Union has to increasingly equip itself moving forward if it wants to protect its citizens. Final point, final big difference and final two. Big messages in terms of content. One has to do with regions, and the other has to do with global governance. In terms of regions, indeed, the 2016 strategy is far more global than back in 2003. And let me just focus. We don't only focus on Asia, but we also focus on Asia. And I think for the first time in the European Union global strategy, we talk about Asia obviously also in economic terms. So there is clearly a China economic focus, particularly taking into consideration China's westward drives, its connectivity drive westwards. But clearly it is not just about China. It is more broadly about Asia, and it is about Asia also in political and security terms. The conceptual step, if you like, that Europeans are making is that very clearly, and we've known this for quite some time, European prosperity hinges very much on Asian prosperity and vice versa, of course. But that prosperity is actually intimately interlinked with Asian security. And therefore, Europeans and European prosperity depends on Asian security. And it is something that I don't need to tell this audience cannot be taken for granted. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves as Europeans is what more can we try and contribute in terms of Asian security? And obviously here we're talking about the rules-based order. We're talking about maritime security, an area where actually the Europeans have relative comparative advantage, meaning that this is the area where actually we're quite good at. If you think about the kind of things that we've been doing off the coast of Somalia in the Mediterranean, these are relative success cases, even for a policy which is as embryonic, if you like, as the common security and defence policy. Final observation on content has to do with global governance. As I said, back in 2003, basically this was about preserving the existing system. In 2016, it's not good enough. That system has to transform in order to remain relevant in the 21st century. And it has to transform in different ways. It has to reform, if you think about the IFIs or indeed the Security Council. It has to be implemented if you think about the Paris Climate Deal, Sustainable Development Goals. It has to be deepened if you think about the trade agenda, bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements as means of deepening global governance, so long as they are then docked back into the WTO and therefore the broader multilateral framework. At times it has to be invented if you think about areas such as cyber. such as energy, such as migration at the global level. These are areas in which global rules and norms are actually very embryonic. At times they have to be created, and we have to play our role in co-shaping, if you like, those nascent rules and norms. So it's a much more, if you like, in this case it is, more transformative approach to global governance than it was back in 2003. Very final set of remarks that I wanted to make, and then I'll stop, has to do with action. Now, back in 2003, basically, we didn't really need to act. We didn't really need to act because things were actually going fairly well. So in a way, if you look at even the length of the 2003 European Security Strategy, it was a very brief document. It's more of a concept than a strategy. It doesn't actually say anything about how to achieve what you want, the vision that you set out to achieve. In fact, I remember talking to the drafter of that strategy. I phoned him up quite early on to ask him for advice. And he said, well, look, the 2003, he said, you don't take this as a reference point because the 2003 European Security Strategy is not a strategy. It talks about the goals, it does not talk about the means. Now, in 2016, we couldn't stop at the story. We couldn't stop at the vision. And that's why the very title of the global strategy is indeed Shared Vision, Common Action. And that's because unlike 2003, in 2016, we do have to act because we're in real trouble. And this is, and here I'll end where we are today. The strategy was presented and welcomed by the European Council in June. Over the course of the summer, we started thinking through how do we start? How do we start the engines on the implementation? 10 days ago, the HRVP sent out a roadmap to all member states and to the European Commission on what would be the elements of implementation for the first year. This is a strategy which is probably going to last until someone has the courage to do something like this again. But I would imagine no less than 7 to 8 years. And in the first year, so the idea is that every year there will be an implementation report to track where we are. The elements on which we will be concentrating for the first year are going to be resilience, an integrated approach to conflicts and crisis, which is a second priority. And I would highlight as a third, and this is really the area where there is most political momentum now, particularly after Brexit, is the security and defence bit of all of this. At the informal summit of heads of state and government, the 27 in this case, in Bratislava a couple of weeks ago, the tasking was given to present an implementation plan on security and defence, and it has to be produced by December. So this is taking up pretty much all of my time at the moment. And just to sort of conclude on this, to say what this is all about. Now, just to be very clear on this, we are not about to set up a European army. No, that is not the intention. In fact, that is language that in many respects harms what we're trying to do. Because it loads it with a symbolism which detracts from the very practical, concrete steps that we have to make. So what are those concrete and practical steps? Defence, security and defence are an area which, as I said, remain very much under the control and the competence of member states. But it's quite clear that if EU member states are to provide security to their citizens, they are actually unable to provide security to their citizens by acting alone or acting disjointly. If you just think about the development of defence capabilities, things like strategic enablers, they cost a lot of money. You're actually unable to produce these things if you have the scale of your average EU member state. And therefore, this is really about defence cooperation, more than defence integration. It is about making sure that the capabilities that are developed in a cooperative manner, and that we as Europeans, and I stress here Europeans, not as EU, but as Europeans, we have all the capabilities that are necessary in order to project peace and stability beyond our borders and to protect Europe itself. So it is really, in a sense, very practical steps that have to be made, and I can get later on into the details of all of this, but very practical steps to be made to make sure that that cooperation, which, to be frank, we've been talking about for a long time, but actually translates into action. And given that we have been talking about it for a long time and it hasn't happened so far, you need to create some incentives for it to happen. And this is basically what, if you like, those concrete steps moving forward have to be. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. And I thought when you quoted Antonio Gramsci and Times of Monsters, it was going to be downhill from there, but I think you finished on a positive note. Let me just and ask a very obvious question, and then I'll hand it over to the audience. I mean, if the problem that we see in Europe is cohesion and legitimacy, why would you pick foreign policy as your area for cooperation? It's probably the most sensitive, difficult area. Why would you focus on foreign policy cooperation if the aim is to try and generate more cohesion and legitimacy?
Actually, what's extremely interesting about the question, and I think the answer, is that it always has been in the past and now it's not. If you think about the main pillars of European integration, which are very simply put, there used to be 3 pillars. It used to be actually structured in this way. Now it's no longer after the Lisbon Treaty, but still these are the main policy areas of European integration, which are the economy, justice and home affairs, and therefore migration, and foreign and security policy. You see that on those first 2, there we really are divided. On economic governance, huge divide, if you like, north and south, since the Eurozone crisis, since the global financial crisis and then the Eurozone crisis, and the economic crisis, which in many parts of southern Europe is not over yet. If you think about migration, again, huge divide, east and west, I would say here. So on those 2 areas, it's actually very difficult, I think, in the next couple of years until this election cycle is over, France, Germany, Italy, etc., to actually have really meaningful progress. Paradoxically, foreign policy is the least contentious area, including on difficult issues like Russia. What is interesting at the moment is that we obviously have our differences, but we value more sticking together than getting 100% of what we would ideally like as individual member states. I thought when working on this that Russia was going to be my biggest headache, and it was not. It was not at all, and it was not at all because everyone knows where the other stands, and everyone has an interest in ultimately having a joint policy. If you think about it, I mean, the result is obvious. We still have a sanctions regime going on. If you ask Italians or Spaniards or Greeks, do you agree with sanctions? They would say no. Does that mean that they vote against a renewal of sanctions? No, it does not, because they value unity more than they value having 100% of what they want. Likewise, solidarity comes in different shapes and forms. On different dossiers, different member states have to agree and do agree that they cannot have 100% of what they want. So I think that partly because on many of these foreign policy issues, member states realize that the challenges and the threats that we face are so huge that they are not able to face them alone. There is much more of an incentive for them to actually work together than there used to be in the past. And I think it's not a coincidence that actually this is the area that heads of state and government that generally don't really take a huge interest in foreign policy have decided to pick on in order to somehow give a new lease of life, if you like, to European integration at a time in which we're so awfully stuck on other dossiers.
Thank you, Nathalie. Now I'll throw the floor open. We've got about 20 minutes or so. Please, just identify yourself and try and keep the questions reasonably short.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Nathalie, for that presentation. It's David Fricker, National Archives of Australia. Look, you mentioned about resilience and looking at America and looking to Asia. But what about with Brexit? You know, now there's a new actor, not a minor actor, you know, in the immediate vicinity of Europe, being Britain. And I'm just wondering, that must be a major disruptor to foreign policy. And what's the, you know, can you expand on that a bit more for us?
Actually, well, for the moment, we're still 28. For the moment, we're still 28, and not only are we 28, but the United Kingdom has been certainly in the process of developing this, and also now in the steps towards implementation, an extremely constructive actor. Foreign policy, whereas when it comes to economic issues, there the going is going to get tough. And the going is going to get tough, not least because, bluntly put, the bargaining power is very unequal. When it comes to foreign policy, there are huge mutual gains to be made, and therefore there is a much greater incentive to actually be constructive on both sides. If you speak to British diplomats now, that what they will tell you is, you know, this stuff over there, we actually agree on 99.9%. In fact, on this particular document, they agree on every word and sentence because they agreed to it. In terms of its implementation, what they would say to you is, on a good 90% of this stuff, we are very happy to work with the European Union. In fact, let's find a way to do this together even after we exit the European Union. Things that the United Kingdom values very highly. Let me just give two examples. Sanctions on Russia, the nuclear deal with Iran would not have been possible without the European Union. So the UK has a huge incentive, and of course, the European Union has a huge incentive in working together with the United Kingdom. Ultimately, this represents 25% of defence spending in Europe, the member state with the most global reach, be it in terms of development, diplomacy, or defence. So there's a huge interest on both sides. Then there will be specific issues that the UK does not like. I personally don't see happening anytime soon, but let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that maybe in 20 or 30 years down the line are going to happen. Your famous European army. There, on those issues, they would say, you know, actually, it's so far down the line, we're not going to be in anyway, so we're not even going to bother. We're not going to bother vetoing anything because there's nothing to veto today. There may then be specific issues which may raise problems. One issue which is being talked about quite a lot is the establishment of headquarters for CSDP missions and operations, permanent headquarters in Brussels, where the United Kingdom and others, by the way, may and do have some doubts. But I think on these issues, once we actually unpack them and get to a level of detail such that it makes it quite clear that we're not talking about some sort of duplication of NATO and NATO structures, I think that actually also the UK is going to come along.
Thank you. Next question. Sir.
Hi, thanks. I'm Nick Prindivall. I'm with Defence. My question was related to Russia as well. I'm wondering if the sort of the securitization of the European Union will cause problems, particularly for states that avoided joining NATO because they didn't want to antagonize Russia. So I'm thinking of Sweden and Finland in particular, perhaps also Austria. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Sweden and Finland, two extremely different cases, and it's very interesting. Finland actually has, precisely because of this, of the threat perception from Russia, which is felt very acutely, has actually changed its position on European defence quite dramatically in recent years. Finland in the past used to be kind of lukewarm about the common security and defence policy because there was no real threat perception there. Now it feels it, and it's made Finland one, I would say, of the key advocates for European defence, security and defence efforts moving forward. Sweden is different, and it has a position which in some respects is actually quite contradictory, because on the one hand, I would say that Sweden and the United Kingdom are probably the two member states that are toughest on Russia. Particularly Sweden does feel the heat very strongly. So you would have thought that as a non-NATO member, they, like Finland, would have been strong advocates, not only of European security and defence in general, but on precisely this idea that the European Union should contribute to the protection of Europe. And this is still a debate that in Finland hasn't resolved itself domestically, I feel. So rationally, if you speak to diplomats, they get it. But politically, the system hasn't quite come there. I can't say the reasons. I don't know why. Maybe it's just a time lag in sort of, realization of, sort of joining the two things, the threat perception and the response to it. Hasn't quite happened yet, but I guess it will happen moving forward.
Could I throw in a question? You gave a list of things that are in the foreign policy toolkit. You rattled off, obviously, economics, aid, energy. The one that you didn't mention was the role of the intelligence services, and from here we see not such a good story of the cooperation.
We don't either.
Just from the outside, in terms of the
from the inside, it's even worse.
Information sharing in Europe on terrorism, counter-terrorism, has not been as good as some of us would have hoped. So maybe you could just talk a little bit in your big vision where the intelligence community fit in.
Yeah, it features quite prominently. I mean, obviously this document was being drafted when shootings and bombs were going off in Paris and Brussels. So it's something that is obviously felt very strongly, and there's a lot of emphasis in the document, both on countering violent extremism and on counterterrorism itself. On counterterrorism, obviously, there is a very strong call for deeper cooperation and information sharing and coordination between intelligence services, both obviously within EU member states, and that is probably the most important thing. You cannot hope to live in a system in which people can freely move across borders, which is a great achievement of European integration, but intelligence communities are not talking to one another. Even more paradoxical, the fact that some member states tend to, their intelligence services tend to talk more to outsiders, in particular the United States, than amongst themselves. Now, I think at the political level, the penny's dropped. They understand that there's a problem. And whether and to what extent this is actually now filtering through the system, I think that we're not quite there yet, but I think we're moving in a way in which we weren't in the past.
Okay. Next. Sir.
Richard Hobbs. Richard Hobbs. It occurs to me that if you introduce a new defence organisation of whatever form, you're going to have a crisis of identity between NATO and that. You sort of touched on that earlier. And with the Europeans desperately needing British maritime power, at least, if not anything else, how are you going to work the differences of the crisis of identity which will occur, either politically or even the public's perception, which is what's going to drive the politicians eventually anyway?
I mean, just to clarify on this point, and I always try and be very careful about this, that in the actual wording, what needs to be strengthened are European security and defence efforts. This means that Europeans have to work more, and they have to work more together in order to have the capabilities they need to do all of the things that we've described. Whether then those capabilities are used in an EU context, a NATO context, a UN context, a multinational coalition context, that is in a sense a second order question. Indeed, today, I would say that if those capabilities are jointly developed, probably when it comes to obviously hard defense capabilities, they will mainly be used in a NATO context. Moving forward, and this depends a lot on how NATO itself evolves, the balance may tilt more towards the European Union. But this will largely depend, in a sense, not so much on what we do, but on the United States itself and its attached importance to NATO. It's clear that if we see a United States, just for the sake of argument, in a sense, increasingly withdrawing from European security, then and in the end it would be mainly Europeans within NATO doing stuff, well, one could well imagine that the balance would then shift from NATO to the EU itself. But we're not there yet, and we shouldn't prejudge that. What we have to do, and the Americans, as I said, have been telling us for quite some time, is that we've got to get more serious. We've got to grow up on security and defence. And therefore, this is what the strategy sets out to do. Never in the strategy do we say that we have to develop EU capabilities. These are member state capabilities that, in order to be developed, have to be developed in a cooperative fashion. And what the EU can do is provide the incentives for that to happen.
Okay, I'll take one more and then we'll draw to a close, please.
Hi, my name's Happy. Just on from Anthony's question, we spoke about the lack of communication, how it impacts, like between the intelligence communities and how that impacts, effective counterterrorism. What is the impact on more traditional state-based threats like espionage and subversion, and how is that impacting not only Europe's ability to combat that, but especially with the rise of, not the rise, but sort of the re-emergence of Russia as an aggressive global actor?
I would say that the way in which, and this is the whole story of hybrid, the way in which Russia is conducting that subversion is, in a sense, been modernizing. So 21st century subversion is different from what it used to be like. So I see it as being less something which falls under the domain of the intelligence communities, because it's really something at times done very explicitly, funding of political parties, funding of media. You can see it. You see it in some member states, obviously more than others, but it's quite clear the way in which many extreme right-wing parties are being financially supported by Russia in social media. So what I'm trying to say here is that the tactics of subversion are changing and they're modernizing, which means that fighting that is going to be, of course, it will always be also the domain of the traditional intelligence communities, but it has to, if you want to tackle the problem, if you like, it really requires a much broader effort, which brings in political and economic and business, etc., actors far more, if you like, into the game.
Thank you, Natalie. I'll just invite the Ambassador, if you wish to say any final remarks, and then I'll close the meeting and you can have an add-on.
Thank you, Anthony. No, just not certainly on foreign policy, because I think Natalie has covered all the points. Just to come back on what Natalie also said on the economy and migration. It looks like that we are moving forward on foreign policy while these two other issues remain intractable. They remain difficult to challenge, but on economic governance, I would say that we have made quite a number of steps forward. The crisis arrived from Wall Street to Europe, becoming banking difficulties, and so on and so forth. And basically, in Europe, we have been a couple of philosophy challenging or debating at the same time. There's a typical German-like ideas, stability create growth. And you have another ideas, more Keynesian idea, and the French, the Italian, and others, growth creates stability. So in the sense of how you use the deficit in the fiscal leverage. So this debate in Europe hasn't finished yet, but certainly this combined approach, stability versus growth, has brought EU largely out of the wood, because basically the economic crisis is largely behind. Economy is back on track. There's Germany, for example, is at the minimum unemployment at 5%, structural, almost full employment. You have Italy's going 1%, Spain is back, Ireland is strongly back. So the recipe has been working. We are not yet basically at where we would like to be in a growth of 2, 3, 4%. We would love to have it. Well, not yet there, but certainly the economic debate has moved forward, and we have the ECB, so the very powerful monetary instrument at independent at work. So we are not we are in a challenging position, but certainly on economy we have moved forward. Migration certainly is another challenge, again another external shock. We haven't invented migration. Migration is happening because our neighborhood is in a very difficult situation, and the New York summit also says there is a global situation. It's a 65 million of migrants. Part are internally displaced, some are refugees. It's not something that belongs only to us. I mean, it belongs to all of us. In Europe, we have reacted according to our law. We are a rule-based organization. 1951 Convention on Refugees enshrined in our treaties, enshrined in our domestic law, can be challenged in any domestic court. We cannot decide to not look at our law. Certainly we had the pendulum, it's a political pendulum. We went through a humanitarian approach like live and rescue, bring people ashore, and right now we see a sort of political pendulum move toward a more securitarian approach. We want to fix the borders, and we have to fix the border, and we have to do all the security to protect the people. So at the end, also migration, we will shift from humanitarian to a securitarian approach. We will land in the middle where we combine the two. So just these two notes to complement what Nathalie has said on foreign policy, and I remain very positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and congratulations on all the hard work you've put in. I think you've convinced most of us that the global strategy does offer at least a strong possibility of giving new force to the European project. But I think, as you said, Nathalie, all these things often really come down to the implementation, don't they? You can have the vision and the plan that you set out, but it comes to the implementation. And it does strike me that one gratuitous suggestion would be try and involve younger people. At the risk of alienating half the audience here, I actually think that millennials are more willing to embrace change than people like me, boomers. So I think as you take that forward, as much as you can, try and inject offer opportunities for younger people to be involved in the process. Would you join with me and thank Nathalie very much for coming along tonight?